part two, I'll say even less, because it's a fairly involved account of the development of the scientific thinking and management of fire. And really what I try and do here is look at the different sectors and how it depended on your theoretical background that you brought with you from the Northern Hemisphere usually, and your management goal very much generated how you thought about fire and how you try to deal with it. So you had the botanists who thought fire was a disaster and was wiping out biodiversity on the mountain. Rudolf Marloff and Margaret Levins and some really actually quite brilliant botanists. Harold Compton was the great, I don't think he was such a brilliant botanist, but he was a very prominent one, and second director of Kirstenbosch, and edited the journal from about, I think 1926 until the early 50s. I'm not exactly sure. He retired to Swaziland. But he funded, Jeremiads regularly in the journal. And this was widely distributed about the evils of fire. So you had a very strong narrative from the botanists, don't burn. And then you had the foresters who didn't want to burn because of the precious trees. And then you had the agricultural guys. And the agricultural guys were based elsewhere. And so you had the centers of that were Natal and the Highveld, and they were doing grass. And the theory that guided all of this came from the Midwestern United States. There was a lot of panic about drought here, and they'd had the Dust Bowl experience in the 30s. And of course there's a cultural dimension, because after let's get this right, my Afrikaans relatives get very cross if I say the Boer War. This is the British War. The South African War. After the South African War, some of the people who became prominent in agriculture went to the States. I mean, why go to Europe? What do they know? There's no felt there, and they're not going to take any lessons from the Brits. So a lot of them went to the States and learned their sort of dryland agri there, and came back, and this Clementsian succession theory was very influential. There was a Nebraskan ecologist called Frederick Clements, and he developed a very convincing narrative about how vegetation develops. It's linear. Everything starts with a sort of primordial nothing, and then you get sort of mosses and rocks, and then you get grasses, and then you get shrubs, and it all progresses. It becomes more and more complex and more resilient, and then eventually it becomes a sort of climax community, and that's usually forest. The great good is trees, and this is the story that's told today. You can read Science magazine, and we should be foresting the world today, even those places which are grasslands, should be trees, which is alarming, but anyway, I digress. So Clementsian theory came here, and it was used as an interpretive framework for understanding the veld here, and it's totally useless for understanding fynbos. Because in that theory, your diversity is driven, it has to go through all the stages to this advanced stage of complexity, and fire regresses it, fire pushes it back. So it was useless for fynbos, but yet this was the kind of dominant government's approach to how we should be dealing with this. The other thing I want to say is that forestry was much more important than I ever realized. I didn't used to like foresters very much. I grew up in game reserves, and they were planting pine trees around them, and actually certainly in the Cape, conservation forestry was massively important, and they ended up running all the catchment areas. But they didn't know how to do burning, and there was a huge fight between foresters and farmers as to whether they should be planting trees. Forestry expanded into the east of the country, and apparently many farmers said, look, these guys are drying up our streams. And this all came to a head in 1935. There was a big conference, international conference, the British Empire Forestry Conference happened here, and they debated this question. And the unfortunate minister, Dennis Rates, he was a Boer War hero, I think a South African war hero, and I think he found himself in the hottest seat he'd been in since then, because he was the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry. And he had both sides, and they decided, Jan Smuts arrived at the conference and stood up and said, this tree planting is bad news, it's got to stop, you guys are aesthetically ruining Table Mountain, and you're drying out the country. It was a big fight. One of the foresters gleefully brought a picture of Jan sitting on the mountain, resting under a pine tree, and he said, yeah, look, funny, he's not taking the shade of a Wakabiki thorn, or, So what they resolved to do was they set up a forest influences research station at Jonkershoek, and it was terribly important. Not many people seem to have heard of it outside of the forestry fire community, but it was very important. It set up in many ways scientific, experimental environmental research here, and really, I suppose they did a big report in 1945. There was a lot of fires, there was a lot of debate over whether they should try and suppress all fires, which of course they could never do. They commissioned a Royal Society report, and they came out and said, we should burn, we should do controlled burning, which was a kind of shocking conclusion at that time. But the forestry department chickened out. There was so much opposition to this idea of burning that they more or less chickened out, and it took about another 20 years before the experimental evidence really became sufficient, that they had the confidence and they got the control to actually start rotational controlled burning in the Cape. 1970, the Catchment Areas Act, forestry on charge, they can do what they want to do, they start burning, but they don't know how. And it's quite difficult. They didn't understand fynbos. And so what I do in the remainder of the chapter, to skip ahead, is I trace the history of how a bunch of really clever and kind of new wave of people, yes, one of whom is sitting over there, Pat, and William Bond, and John Richardson, and also Richard Cowling, a whole sort of new wave of people, Brian van Wilken came through and became energized by an international move, Mediterranean type, it's now called Mediterranean type climate systems, but a bunch of people around the world, Western Australia, parts of Australia, California, Chile, around the Mediterranean region, all have the same kind of vegetation, fire adapted. Climate has a big influence, this Mediterranean kind of climate we have here. All started realizing, hang on, there's a lot of similarities between our systems, let's try and work them out. And the South Africans were really a key part of that. So there was a renaissance of research in that time, and the foresters were at the heart of this. They actually had a joined up system of, you had planners, which I don't know exist really. They had planners, they had researchers, and they had managers, and they met up in these Mara meetings, and it was kind of daunting. If you were a researcher and you had some clever idea about how to burn, they'd say, fine, we're going to burn this mountain range and let's see. So, you have to have the courage of your convictions. And they learnt an enormous amount, but the more they learnt, the more difficult it became to burn under the right conditions, and then safely. And then we had the end of apartheid. So basically, once there was a real momentum going, apartheid started to fall apart, thank heavens. And the problem is that the institution which ran these mountain areas and had this knowledge and this fell apart. So the Groot Crocodile sort of abolished national forestry really in 1987, and then things wound down, and suddenly all of these national catchments were devolved onto local conservation authorities who had neither the knowledge or the manpower to deal with it, or the budgets, and were, a lot of them, I think, afraid of burning, and so didn't. And so things went into a real tailspin in the 90s. And obviously the perspective, the attention of the new government was on other things than managing the fynbos. In the 90s we were very dry. And so what we have is, coming back to this 2000 story where I start the book and end the book, was a really bad fire situation and a real lack of joined up management. So the ANC approach then to development was to regionalize it, and so you had a real fragmentation, and so they tried to sort of step up with legislation and make farmers and local people take on these responsibilities with very mixed success. The one thing that did happen was working for water, and I think Guy Preston and Brian and Van Wilken and others realized, well, certainly the CSR, Centre for Science and Industrial Research, which all old foresters, we were in Forest Tech, ended up stuck in CSIR. they suddenly realized, well, we have a major funding problem here, and the way through was to sort of reframe the research as ecosystem services research, and water was the way to do it. And if you could join up poverty relief with environmental management, it was a brilliant solution for the time, but not so much for fire, because fire became a problem because it encouraged invasive plants, and so I think it enhanced a sort of negative ideas about fire. And also they went and cut down all these naughty invasive things, and when the fire came through January 2000, there were nice big piles of tinder, certainly down in the southern part near Red Cliffs this way. So a mixed blessing, if you like. So that's the whistle-stop tour of where we were at with the fire research. We actually knew an enormous amount about it now, but it hadn't gotten through. The management of it had actually fallen apart, and people weren't really doing all the burning they were supposed to do.